Nuclear energy, the cool kid of power generation. Harnessing the power within an atom to power our lights, our refrigerators, our air conditioners, our Roombas, our fancy electric cars, and everything else in our lives. But how does nuclear technology actually work? What even are those big fancy towers? Doesn't every nuclear reactor blow up and kill everyone? Isn't there a whole bunch of radioactive waste? Is nuclear technology actually the key to fixing climate change, or is it just a ticking time bomb? Is nuclear even better than those dirty fossil fuels or those lame renewables like wind and solar? Let's find out. The concept of the atom, the fundamental building block of all matter, has been around since the ancient Greeks. But it wasn't until the 19th century that scientists began to understand the basic components: the proton, the neutron, and the electron. In 1934, physicist Enrico Fermi discovered that atoms could be split into separate, smaller atoms using neutrons. This process also happens to create a lot of excess energy. In 1941, the United States joined World War II, and suddenly Uncle Sam was very interested in this excess energy for, say, a bomb. In 1942, Fermi and his colleagues created the first nuclear reactor, where the fission of one atom would produce fission in another atom in a self-sustaining loop. In 1945, the United States finished development of the world's first nuclear bombs and dropped the bombs Little Boy and Fat Man on Japan, forcing them to surrender, but killing tens of thousands of civilians in the process. After the war, the United States began to wonder, what if nuclear power could do stuff other than killing people? Throughout the 50s, the US began to develop commercial power plants powered by nuclear energy, successfully deploying the first one in Pennsylvania in 1957. After the theory was proved, nuclear power exploded in popularity in the 1960s, offering clean, safe, and economical alternatives to fossil fuels. Nuclear power plants began to pop up all over the world, but production would eventually slow. Crises like 3 Mile Island in 1979, Chernobyl in 1986, and later Fukushima in 2011 created distrust in nuclear power. Throughout the 90s and 2010s, nuclear power declined in popularity and scale. As countries canceled orders for nuclear power plants, decommissioned existing plants, and relied more and more on safer renewables like wind or solar. But the nuclear industry has not disappeared. As the demand for carbon-free energy continues to increase, the nuclear plants continue to be built, and the nuclear industry promises even cheaper, safer, and smaller plants going into the future. Today, there are 65 reactors under construction, 406 reactors in operation, and 221 closed reactors. But how does a nuclear power plant actually work? Well, the nuclear fuel, usually uranium-235, is placed in fuel rods in the core. Fission is triggered when a neutron crashes into a uranium atom, splitting it into barium and krypton and releasing 2 other neutrons. These neutrons then crash into other uranium atoms, continuing the process. The reaction is controlled by the water in which the fuel rods are placed, slowing down the reaction, as well as by control rods that can be inserted to slow down the reaction even further. The water surrounding the fuel rods also absorbs the excess heat from the fission reaction and is used to boil a separate source of water at a lower pressure. The steam from this reaction then turns a turbine that powers a generator, which creates electricity. The steam from the turbine eventually cools back down into water, is pumped into a cooling tower to cool down even further, and then pumped back into the reactor to repeat the process. Now you can make a reactor of your own. Now, why is nuclear power useful? Nuclear power's main advantage is that it doesn't contribute to climate change. Traditional fossil fuel power plants burn coal or natural gas to create heat energy instead of the fission process. This releases greenhouse gases such as CO2 into the atmosphere, which block heat from leaving the Earth's system. The Earth has gotten a whole 2.63 degrees warmer since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Now, this doesn't sound like a lot, but ocean levels are rising, forest levels are shrinking, hurricanes and floods are becoming more frequent, and animal species are going extinct at an increasingly alarming rate. In 2022, 16.6 billion tons of CO2 were released into the atmosphere by the electricity and heat industry, more than double any other source of carbon emissions. Per terawatt hour, or roughly the energy required to electrify an entire city for a year, nuclear energy only produces 6 tons of CO2. Natural gas produces 440 tons of CO2, while coal produces 970 tons of carbon dioxide. Since its inception, nuclear power has replaced 50 billion tons of CO2 that would have come from fossil fuel power plants. But if nuclear energy is so good for preventing climate change, why is it so unpopular? Well, in short, the common belief is that when nuclear goes wrong, it goes really wrong. Harnessing the same processes of a nuclear bomb can have some serious consequences. If the process of nuclear cooling is stopped, the fission reaction can grow out of control, releasing a potentially lethal dose of radiation into the surrounding area. 3 major incidents have occurred at nuclear power plants since their invention: 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, and Fukushima. However, only the 1986 disaster at Chernobyl actually resulted in any direct deaths. The reason for this is that nuclear energy is far safer than the public media would have you believe. Firstly, there's no possible way for a nuclear reactor to explode. The fuel simply isn't pure enough to cause a reaction strong enough to create an explosion. Secondly, a nuclear meltdown's effects are so localized around the plant that they are unlikely to cause many problems. For instance, during the 2011 Fukushima disaster, where a record-breaking earthquake and ensuing tsunami led to a triple meltdown at the nuclear power plant, there were no direct deaths, and over 200 people worked on site after the incident to help mitigate its effect with no radiation poisoning. Safety is the first priority of all nuclear power plants, and extreme caution is taken at every step. Designs and materials are vetted thoroughly, comprehensive testing and monitoring are required on a regular basis, and prevention and cleanup plans are made in the 1 in 100,000 year chance that the core is damaged. Chernobyl resulted in deaths precisely because these now commonplace measures were deliberately ignored by the Soviet Union. Nuclear is actually the second safest form of energy per terawatt hour, with 0.0 deaths happening per terawatt hour of energy generation, including indirect deaths from Chernobyl and Fukushima, compared to 24.6 deaths per terawatt hour produced for coal due to frequent accidents during extraction and mining. Another major concern regarding nuclear energy is radioactive waste. Spent uranium can no longer be used for fuel, but is still highly radioactive and can resist contaminating the local environment. However, it's worth noting that your average nuclear reactor only produces 5 cubic meters of high-level waste a year, compared to the 300,000 tons of ash and more than 6 million tons of carbon dioxide per year from a coal-based power plant. Nuclear waste still presents a problem if handled improperly. So far, in the US, all waste is stored in temporary on-site waste housing, and no deaths or environmental harm has been caused by commercial nuclear waste yet, but a long-term underground storage site has yet to materialize, and critics warn of increasing amounts of waste with nowhere to put it. Now, I hope you're feeling a bit more positive about nuclear energy now that you know a power plant isn't going to explode like a nuclear bomb anytime soon, or that radioactive green goo isn't flowing through the cities of America. In fact, I hope you gained a new appreciation for nuclear power after learning how it works and how much carbon it can save. But here's the thing. I haven't been entirely honest with you. Despite its carbon impact, its stable energy production, and just how dang cool it is, in terms of money, time, and efficiency, nuclear just isn't as good. Other renewables like wind and solar beat it in almost every way. Now, the main goal for both renewable and nuclear energy is to remove as much carbon dioxide from the systems of energy production as quickly as possible. Mitigating climate change is the goal. Otherwise, we would all just stick to the cheap and already available fossil fuel plants. We need to do this quickly, as every year the world's energy is predominantly produced from fossil fuel. The Earth's temperature is getting closer and closer to the point of no return in terms of environmental disaster and climate disruption. Success will be measured in the greatest amount of greenhouse reductions per dollar per year. It doesn't matter if nuclear power cuts down emissions if wind and solar can do so cheaper and faster. And here's the thing. Nuclear power plants are expensive and take a long time to build. The average cost per megawatt hour, which includes startup and continuous expenses produced by advanced nuclear reactors, is $110 per megawatt hour. While wind only has a cost of $40 per megawatt hour, and solar has a cost of $55 per megawatt hour, expected to fall to $25 per megawatt hour by 2050. Solar and wind have become drastically cheaper in the past 30 years, while nuclear still remains extremely expensive. Nuclear power plants are large and on the whole must be constructed uniquely for each specific site. Not to mention expensive safety measures and waste storage schemes make for steep operating costs. Nuclear power plants also take forever to build. The average construction time for a new nuclear power plant is a little over 10 years, with frequent delays and cost overruns. In 2022 through 2024, not a single new reactor built was not hit with a new delay. Meanwhile, a new solar farm, if constructed efficiently, can be fully completed within 8 months. Even if every country in the world were to drop everything and fully commit itself to nuclear power, it would still take so long to implement that climate change would still have irrevocable impacts. And finally, the one last issue with nuclear power in the modern day is that even if it were cheaper and faster to build, it just isn't flexible enough to deal with today's power grid. The fundamental issue has to do with this oddly duck-shaped graph. Power consumption changes throughout the day, remaining low during working hours when everyone's out of the house, and spiking at night when everyone comes home and turns on their lights and starts using their electronics and appliances. Now, solar power and wind energy are variable energy sources. The sun doesn't always shine, and the wind doesn't always blow when the energy grid needs them to. And the energy grid has begun to adapt to meet these changes as the percentage of both solar and wind energy increases. The grid has become increasingly decentralized, and large batteries have been constructed to consolidate power when it's produced and to distribute power when it's needed. In this new paradigm, where power supply and power demand regularly outpace each other, nuclear energy is left woefully unadaptable as a constant, unchangeable flow of energy. Now, proponents argue that nuclear power should be used to provide baseload power production, to fill in gaps where solar and wind aren't making up for energy demand. However, what do you do with the excess power generated when solar and wind are working? A nuclear power plant cannot simply be turned off whenever necessary, and this power does need to go somewhere. The only solution is to decentralize the grid further and build more advanced batteries. And at that point, why not trade out nuclear for the cheaper solar and the cheaper wind and use their excess power in the same way that we do now? In conclusion, despite how safe and beneficial and just plain cool nuclear energy can be, it just isn't the way forward for a carbon-free future. Solar and wind are king, and nuclear, well, nuclear just can't keep up.